The day my boss grabbed my wrist in the parking garage, I told myself it was nothing. He was under pressure. The Delacroix account had just gone sideways, and men like him, the kind who wear their power like a second skin, they don't handle pressure gracefully. I told myself that as I drove home with 4 fingerprint bruises blooming on the inside of my arm. That was 6 months before everything changed. My name is Lydia, and for 3 years I was the executive assistant to Coleman Vance, CEO of Vance Capital Group, a mid-sized private equity firm headquartered in downtown Chicago. I was 29 when I took the job. I needed the money. My mother had been in and out of the hospital that year with her heart, and her insurance had gaps the size of swimming pools. Coleman's offer was $42,000 more than anything else I'd been offered, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further. I am not small. I'm 5'4" and I've been plus size since college, and I've spent most of my adult life learning how to make myself invisible in spaces that were not built for women who look like me. I became very good at it. I learned how to sit in ways that took up less room. I learned how to speak so that powerful men felt like they were the ones talking. I learned how to dress for credibility rather than comfort, and how to smile through things that should have made me walk out the door. Coleman Vance was 51, silver-haired, and the kind of handsome that money polishes over time. He called me sweetheart once during my second week, and I pretended not to hear it. He made a comment about my figure at the holiday party. Something about how I carried myself well for a bigger girl. And I laughed like it was a compliment, because 16 other employees were standing within earshot, and I could not afford to lose that job. The morning everything changed was a Tuesday in February. Cold the way Chicago gets cold when it means it, where the wind doesn't just cut through you, it makes a point. I had gotten in at 7:30, which was normal for me. Coleman liked his coffee on his desk before 8, his messages sorted, his calendar reviewed. I had been doing this for 3 years without a single missed morning. I was at my desk when I heard them come in. The firm had been in quiet talks with a group of European investors, a consortium out of Frankfurt called Bergmann Holtz, for 4 months. The deal would have been the largest acquisition in the firm's history. $47 million in capital, contingent on a successful audit of our existing portfolio. Coleman had flown to Frankfurt twice. He'd hosted their lead representative, a man named Dieter Meyer, at the firm twice after that. I had handled every calendar entry, every catering order, every car service booking for those visits. What Coleman did not know, what no one in that building knew, was that I spoke German. Not tourist German, real German. My grandmother came to Chicago from Stuttgart in 1962, and she refused to let English be the only language in our house. I grew up spending summers with her in Rogers Park, conjugating verbs, and watching old West German films. I took it through high school, studied it for 2 years in college, and then put it in a drawer the way you put things away when the world doesn't give you obvious use for them. It had been sitting there for years, quiet and forgotten, like a lot of things about me that Coleman Vance had never bothered to ask about. The Bergmann Holtz team arrived at 9. 3 men, all in charcoal suits, all carrying the kind of leather briefcases that cost more than a month of my rent. Dieter Meyer was in his late 50s, compact and precise the way some Europeans are. He shook Coleman's hand and switched immediately into English. Perfect English, actually, the kind that comes from years of deliberate practice. They went into the conference room. I brought in water and the pastry assortment I had ordered from the place on Michigan Avenue that Coleman liked, and I set everything up and closed the door quietly and went back to my desk, which was positioned as it had been for 3 years, directly adjacent to the conference room wall. The walls in that building were not thick. I could hear them clearly. For the first 40 minutes, everything was in English, and it was what I expected. Pleasantries, high-level portfolio review, the kind of circling that happens before anyone says what they actually mean. And then Dieter Meyer's phone buzzed, and he excused himself, and I heard the sound of the door opening and closing. What happened in the next 7 minutes is what I need you to understand. Dieter stepped into the small alcove just outside the conference room, maybe 10 feet from my desk, and he made a phone call. I heard him say, in German, clear as anything, "It's exactly what we suspected. The Chicago numbers are falsified. The Whitmore Fund is leveraged at 3 times what they've disclosed. We move to the secondary offer. Tell Frankfurt we pull after the signing." He wasn't speaking to me. He didn't know I was there. He didn't know I could understand a word. I sat at my desk with my hands in my lap and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. The secondary offer. I knew what that meant. Coleman had briefed me on the deal structure months ago. I'd typed the term sheets myself. There was a primary acquisition offer, and there was a secondary offer that would activate only if the primary fell through. The secondary offer was structured entirely differently. It would essentially allow Bergmann Holtz to acquire the firm's most valuable asset, the Whitmore Fund, at a dramatically reduced price in the event of a disclosed financial irregularity. In other words, they knew the books were cooked. And they were going to let the deal proceed until the signing, then trigger the irregularity clause, walk away with the Whitmore Fund for 40 cents on the dollar, and leave Coleman holding a fraud investigation. I sat there for a long time after Dieter went back into the conference room. Then I opened my desk drawer and I took out a legal pad and I wrote down, word for word, what I had heard. I wrote it in English. I dated it. I signed it. I want to be very clear about what I was feeling in that moment, because it would be easy to say I felt nothing. That I was cold and calculating and strategic. That's not true. My hands were shaking. I had worked for Coleman Vance for 3 years. I had covered for him, scheduled his life, learned his preferences, managed his moods. I had laughed at things that weren't funny and smoothed over things that should have been confrontations. Whatever he had done to me, and however he had made me feel small, I was still a human being sitting with information that could end his career, and that is not a comfortable thing to hold. But then I thought about those fingerprints on my arm, and I thought about the holiday party comment, and I thought about the meeting 3 months ago where he introduced me to a new board member as my girl, and then, when the board member looked confused, clarified, my assistant. Like those two things were interchangeable. I thought about all of it, and I made a decision. I called my cousin, who is a paralegal at a firm on the North Side. I did not tell her what I knew. I asked her who, in her professional opinion, was the best white-collar attorney in Chicago. She gave me a name without hesitating, a woman named Philippa Okafor, who had spent 14 years as a federal prosecutor before going into private practice. I looked her up on my lunch break. I emailed her office that afternoon. I did not say a word to Coleman. The meeting with Philippa happened 4 days later, on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop in Lincoln Square. She was about 50, natural hair, reading glasses pushed up on her head, the kind of calm that comes from having seen everything. I walked in already nervous. I had brought my legal pad, the signed note, and 3 years of my own meticulously kept records. I should explain the records. I am, by nature and by training, someone who documents things. I have kept a professional log since my first week at Vance Capital. Not because I was planning anything, but because Coleman was erratic and I learned early that when things went wrong, assistants got blamed, and I needed to be able to show my work. Every task I completed, I logged. Every instruction I was given, I wrote down with the date and time. Every meeting I coordinated, every document I handled. Over 3 years, I had built something I didn't realize was evidence until I sat across from Philippa Okafor, and she went through it page by page, not saying anything, just reading, with her reading glasses slid down to the end of her nose. "Tell me about the Whitmore Fund," she said finally. I told her everything I knew. Not just what I'd overheard, everything. The inconsistencies I'd noticed in the quarterly documents that came across my desk. The time Coleman had asked me to shred a particular version of a file and replace it with a revised one, and I had done it without asking because that was my job, but I had noted it. The phone calls I'd routed to a private number that wasn't on any official company directory. Philippa looked at me over her glasses for a long time. "You understand," she said, "that what you're describing potentially exposes you to liability as well. You processed some of these documents." "I know," I said.
"And you still came here."
"I came here," I said, "because in 4 days, $47 million is going to change hands based on falsified financials, and a group of people in Frankfurt are going to walk away with the most valuable part of this firm for a fraction of what it's worth, and my boss is going to claim he knew nothing about any of it, and somehow I will be the one explaining why I shredded that file." She wrote something down. "What do you want out of this?" No one had asked me that before. I had to think about it. "I want it on the record," I said, "that I didn't know, that I reported what I knew as soon as I understood what it meant. I want documentation that I cooperated." I paused. "And I want my severance, whatever I'm legally owed, because after this I am not going back to that office." Philippa nodded slowly. "That's very reasonable," she said. "Let me make some calls." What happened in the next 72 hours is something I'll spend a long time processing. Philippa contacted the SEC. She also contacted a former colleague at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The signing was still 3 days out, which was enough time, barely, to put the right people in position. I was interviewed twice, once informally and once on the record. I handed over my legal pad, my 3 years of logs, and signed a cooperation agreement that Philippa reviewed line by line with me before I put my name on it. The day of the signing, I went to the office. I made Coleman's coffee. I sorted his messages. I smiled at the Bergmann Holtz team when they came in, and I brought water to the conference room, and I closed the door quietly, and I went back to my desk. At 11:14 a.m., 3 federal agents walked into Vance Capital Group. One of them was carrying a document I recognized. I had typed an earlier draft of it myself 2 years ago, during a regulatory review I thought had been routine. Coleman came out of the conference room when he heard the commotion. I watched his face do something I had never seen it do in 3 years. It went very still, and then it went gray, like color draining out of a photograph. Dieter Meyer, who had followed him into the hallway, said something under his breath in German that I won't repeat here. The federal agent in front asked Coleman Vance to come with them. He looked across the office and his eyes landed on me. I don't know what he was looking for. Shock, maybe. Or confirmation that this was happening. I held his gaze for a moment, and then I looked back at my screen, because there was a call I still needed to return, and I wasn't going to let him see my hand shaking. He was escorted out at 11:31 a.m. I gave my 2 weeks' notice that same afternoon in writing to the firm's general counsel, with a copy to HR and a copy to Philippa. I cleaned out my desk that evening. I took home the small succulent I'd been keeping on my windowsill for 2 years, and a framed photo of my grandmother, and my good noise-canceling headphones. I want to tell you what came next, because this is the part that surprises people. I didn't feel triumphant. Not immediately. I sat in my car in the parking garage for probably 20 minutes, and I felt tired. 3 years of making myself smaller. 3 years of laughing at the wrong things and absorbing the right insults and doing my job so well that no one thought to ask what else I knew. I felt the weight of that leaving, and it felt like putting down something very heavy, and I was not prepared for how much my arms had been hurting. My mother called me that night. I hadn't told her anything. I didn't want her to worry. She just called to check in the way she does, and I answered and she said, "You sound different. What happened?" I told her everything. We were on the phone for 2 hours. Coleman Vance was indicted 4 months later on 5 counts of securities fraud. The Whitmore Fund irregularities turned out to go back further than anyone initially suspected, almost 7 years. 2 other senior executives were also charged. Dieter Meyer and Bergmann Holtz were referred for separate proceedings in Germany. The deal obviously never closed. I was not charged with anything. My cooperation agreement was honored exactly as written. The legal process took time, it always does. But 6 weeks after I left Vance Capital, something unexpected happened. Philippa called me on a Wednesday afternoon and said that the court-appointed receiver overseeing the firm's assets had a question for me. Would I be willing to serve as a paid consultant to help reconstruct the financial documentation trail? 3 months of work, well above what I'd been making as an assistant. I said yes. I moved through those 3 months carefully, methodically, the way I have always moved through things. I rebuilt a paper trail that had been deliberately obscured. I sat in rooms with forensic accountants and federal attorneys and answered their questions and asked my own. One of the accountants, a woman a few years older than me named Simone, told me about 6 weeks in that the level of detail in my personal logs had been, in her words, remarkable. You documented everything, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I always have, I said. After the consulting work ended, I took 3 weeks off. I went to see my grandmother, who is 87 now and still lives in Rogers Park. I sat with her in her kitchen, and we watched old movies, and I let her feed me too much, and I told her in German about the phone call in the alcove, and she laughed. This wonderful surprised laugh, and said in German, he didn't know who he was dealing with. I started looking for jobs after that. I had references I hadn't had before, including one from Philippa, and my resume had a line on it now that I hadn't expected to put there. The interviews went differently. People listened differently. One hiring manager, at a financial compliance firm downtown, read through my background and looked up and asked, "Is this the Vance Capital case?" "Yes," I said. She hired me 3 days later at a salary that was significantly more than Coleman had ever paid me. I've been at the new firm for 8 months now. I have my own office, which still surprises me every morning. A room with a door that I can close. My title is Compliance Documentation Specialist, which is one of those titles that sounds boring until you understand that it means I am the person whose job it is to make sure that the paper trail tells the truth. That nothing gets shredded. That nothing gets revised without a record. That the documentation says what actually happened, not what someone wished had happened. I am very good at this job. I want to say one more thing, because I think about it often. There is a version of this story where I heard Dieter Meyer's phone call and I said nothing. Where I went back to making coffee and sorting messages and telling myself it wasn't my problem, that I wasn't paid to be a whistleblower, that getting involved would only cost me. I understand that version. I understand why someone would make that choice. But here is what I know. I had spent 3 years making myself smaller in that office. 3 years of accommodating and absorbing and smoothing things over. I had gotten so practiced at it that I had almost stopped noticing. And when I sat down with that legal pad and wrote out what I had heard, something happened that I can only describe as taking up exactly as much space as I actually occupy. It turns out that is a lot of space. It turns out I had been holding 7 years of German in a drawer for a reason. My grandmother called me last month. We talked for a long time the way we always do, mixing languages the way our family does. Some sentences in English, some in German, some in both. Before she hung up, she said something she says to me sometimes, something she said in Stuttgart once, to a man who told her she wasn't qualified for a job she eventually got and kept for 20 years. She said, "They counted you before they counted on you. That was their mistake." I wrote it down. I still have the note.